Before we start, I need to offer two quick comments, and here's the first. Writing True Confessions involved 3 years of researching American Catholic life. It was a great experience, sobering, but in the end also deeply hopeful. We hear about the problems in the church all the time, but the people in the apostolates doing great work in the church, and there are too many of them to count, get overlooked. One of the reasons I did True Confessions was to give those people a voice. And at the end of it, Collegium stands out as one of the real success stories of the lay Catholic vocation in the United States over the last decade. Dan Sheely and his colleagues have done a great job growing Collegium's mission. They deserve our gratitude and praise, and it's a pleasure to be with you today to say that publicly. My other comment is simply this. I served as senior aide to Archbishop Charles Chaput for 23 years. We stay in touch several times a week even now. And as he notes in his introduction to True Confessions, our thinking coincided on every major issue facing the church and today's culture. And it led to a lot of very fruitful discussions and shared work. The Archbishop is a man of very keen intelligence, and I think his guidance on matters of church, state, and society is some of the best available anywhere. So I borrow freely from his body of work here with his permission and blessing. So with that out of the way, let's begin. My task today is suggesting how we might live the civic virtues and act as good citizens. In other words, what do we mean by a healthy Christian citizenship, and how do we get it? I'm going to offer some answers, but to do that, we need to know where we are now as a culture and how we got there. We also need a framework for our thinking as we go forward. And Augustine of Hippo is a good source for it because he lived in a time of turmoil and conflict very similar to our own. And finally, we need the practical guidelines of Catholic social teaching to fully understand and act on those two magic words of our civic vocabulary, freedom and justice. Exactly a week ago today, the Wall Street Journal published a huge story, roughly 4,000 words, which for a newspaper, daily newspaper, is a lot of copy, on the political disillusionment of Gen Z Americans. Gen Z is the age group of 11 to 26, and it's the most pessimistic in U.S. history. Less than half of Gen Zers state that their mental health is good, and 40% claim that they've seen a therapist to receive treatment. They have low to no confidence in the political process and pretty much the same view of every major social institution. And they'll be running the country in 20 years. The question is why? Why the pessimism? Why the disaffection? For an answer, we might consider the following list of facts, which are not comprehensive, but they do make some sense. First, people and nations obviously change all the time. Change is natural and healthy, so long as it grows organically out of the past and at a pace people can digest and absorb. But the nature and pace of change in our culture today have no precedent. They're extraordinarily fast. They're also accelerating. They're also too radical for most people to integrate easily into their lives, which leads to a pervasive sense of discontinuity and confusion. Now, lots of things contribute to this confusion, but among the most important are the changes, and not just changes, but deep transformations in technology that then drive the upheavals in our laws, our sexual mores, our educational methods and philosophy, and our economy. In effect, we're living through a version of the new Reformation, literally a new reformation or restructuring of how we think about the world, society, and what a human being is. Second, we can't go back to the good old days. That's partly because nostalgia is always misleading. The good old days had plenty of their own problems. And partly because the gulf between American culture in 1954 and 2024 is too wide and too deep to bridge. America is a much less biblically influenced nation than it was at its founding, or even when I was a child 60 years ago. Our moral vision of who we are, what our lives mean, and what citizenship means is much more fragmented. I mean, we all talk piously about serving the common good, but what the common good means very different things to very different people. Here's my third point. Democracy has many strengths, but it also has some serious weaknesses. It advances equality by leveling out social inequities, but it goes much further than that. It also tends to flatten out distinctions and hierarchies of every kind. Absent a vigorous religious faith, democracy flattens out even the human spirit, because any kind of divine transcendence or human excellence also implies a kind of inequality. And this is why Alexis de Tocqueville said that democracy creates not just a different kind of political order, but a new and different kind of humanity. Democracy exists, at least theoretically, to ensure the freedom of the individual. And of course, that's a very good thing. But in doing so, democracy can easily become hostile to any obligations that the individual himself doesn't freely choose or create. And that makes a problem for Christians because we don't invent our own stories out of nothing. We inherit, and we're part of, a much larger sacred story of mutual dependence, not independence, but dependence on each other, that links us to the communion of saints across time and continents. We have the power to contribute to that story, but we don't own it. Now, what that means is that families, communities, churches, all these things place pre-existing duties on the individual, duties that limit and channel his or her liberty. Therefore, they're suspect and can end up being attacked, which accounts in part for the atmosphere we now have. Here's a fourth point. Technology is always a mixed blessing. It giveth and it taketh away. We use our tools, but our tools also use us. They shape the way we think, the way we act, and the way we see the world. And I'll give you an example. I've been a video gamer for 45 years. I love it. I built computers. I love computer technology. But my mind was formed by a typographic print culture. And so it affects me in a very different way than it probably affects you or children. You know, I mean, it's just a different way of looking at the world. I was formed in a print culture that teaches me to think very logically and come to a period at the end of a sentence. That's not the way an image-based society operates. It's very much more simultaneous and immediate. Technological man sees the world not as a gift of God with its own purpose and meaning to be stewarded and treasured, but as a collection of dead material to be organized and used. And that utility attitude eventually infects the way we treat the environment, other living creatures, other people, and our own bodies and selves. We Americans are especially prone to this kind of technological thinking because we've always been a deeply practical, pragmatic, inventive people, traits that we get from our Puritan Calvinist past and the need to subdue a rough new continent. Americans solve material problems exceptionally well. That's what we're really good at as a culture. And we instinctively judge our worth by our material success. In effect, intentionally or otherwise, we've created the most successful materialist society in history. And we've done it without the inconvenience of a Lenin or a Mao Zedong. The danger is that we end up a nation of self-absorbed consumers with huge and endless appetites instead of a community of thinking, politically mature citizens. Now, here's my fifth and final point for this section. Reality is much bigger and richer than we can measure with our instruments and senses, but in practice we train ourselves to disbelieve in the reality of anything beyond our instruments and senses. This means that science and technology are never truly neutral. They always begin with the unstated bias that the world they can measure and prove is the only world that matters. This ends up diminishing other vital types of learning and wisdom, like the humanities, as somehow less factual and credible. And then the human spirit begins to starve. And a starved spirit results in pessimism, disillusionment, and anger. If you want to understand the culture we're living in right now, just remember that well, let me give you an example. I mean, my problem as a person is that I get angry a lot, okay? My wife helped me identify that years ago. For the guys in the audience, please don't ask your wife what your main problem is, because she'll tell you. But anyway, most of the people I know are angry about something most of the time. Now, if you take that and multiply it by 90 or 100 million or 350 million people, what do you get? You get the kind of intensely toxic culture that we're in right now. And that's roughly where we are. That's our trajectory. So the point is, what can we do about it? How do we live faithfully as Christians and citizens in such a different new culture? It's part of our American DNA, a DNA to want a well-crafted strategic plan, a business plan to get the church back into the influence game. But living cultures are not corporations or building projects that we can come up with some sort of mathematical conclusion to. They're living organisms. There's no quick fix for problems that we behaved ourselves into, and the culture we have now is a culture we Christians ourselves help to make with our appetites, our distractions, and our compromises. The only way to create new life in a culture, including the bones and body of a political culture, is to live our lives as individuals ruled by virtues and convictions greater than ourselves, and then shared with people we know and love. It's a path that's very simple and very hard at the same time because it involves changing ourselves. But it's the only way to make a revolution that actually lasts and matters. And that leads us to St. Augustine. Robert Dodaro, the Augustinian priest and scholar, wrote a very fine book 20 years ago called Christ and the Just Society and the Thought of Augustine. Dodaro makes 4 points about Augustine's view of Christianity and politics. First, Augustine never actually offers a political theory, and there's a reason. He doesn't believe human beings can know and create a perfect justice in this world. Our judgment is always flawed by our sinfulness. Therefore, the right starting point for any Christian politics is humility, modesty, and a very sober realism about who and what we are. Second, no political order, no matter how seemingly good, can ever constitute a just society. Errors in moral judgment can't be avoided, and these errors also grow in their complexity as they move from lower to higher levels of society and governance. Therefore, the Christian needs to be loyal to his nation and obedient to its legitimate rulers. But he also needs to cultivate a skepticism and critical vigilance about both. Third, despite these concerns, Christians still have a duty to take part in public life according to their God-given abilities, even when their faith brings them into conflict with public authority. We can't simply ignore or withdraw from civic affairs. The reason is simple. The classic civic virtues named by Cicero, prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance, Christians know them as the cardinal virtues, can be renewed and elevated to the benefit of all citizens by the Christian theological virtues of faith, hope, and charity. Therefore, political engagement is a worthy Christian task, and public office is an honorable Christian vocation. Fourth, in governing as best they can, while conforming their lives and their judgment to the content of the gospel, Christian leaders in public life can accomplish real good, and they can make a difference. Their success will always be limited and mixed. It will never be ideal, but with the help of God, they can improve the moral quality of society, which makes the effort invaluable. Now, what Augustine believes about Christian leaders, we can reasonably extend to the vocation of all Christian citizens, including us here and now. The skills of the Christian citizen are finally very simple: a zeal for Jesus Christ, rooted in Scripture and the believing community, an appropriate conscience informed by humility and truth, the prudence to see which issues in public life are vital and foundational to human dignity and which may be important but are not foundational, and the courage to work for what's right. Now, we never cultivate these skills alone. We develop them together as Christians in prayer, on our knees, in the presence of Jesus Christ, and also at gatherings like today. What the church expects us to do in our public lives as citizens is to follow our consciences. But we first need to form our consciences intelligently in accord with Christian truth. A healthy conscience is a blessing, but it's never a convenience. It's not a free-floating personal opinion machine. It needs to be developed and disciplined in a way that enables it to recognize what's right and then to insist on what's right, even when we don't want to hear about it. What the church asks is that before we vote, for example, since this is an election year, we at least make a sincere effort to understand the truths which she teaches and why she teaches them, and then try honestly to follow her wisdom. If we do that, we've done what our faith requires by putting our faith first. And that might sound easy, but it's very hard in our current culture where serious thought about anything is drowned out in emotion, distraction, heat, name-calling, and noise. As Catholics, it's our job to remove ourselves from those things, even if it's just mentally setting ourselves apart, and to think before we act so that when we do act, we do so with our brain and an examined conscience and not just with our bile and emotions and the latest distortions from our mass media. Augustine said that it makes no sense to whine about the darkness of the times because we are the times. We make the times with the content and choices of our everyday lives, which ripple out to influence others and through them over time shape entire cultures. Christianity is never mainly about politics, despite how it looks in a year like this year. It's about living and sharing the love of God. And the work of Christian civic engagement, when it happens, belongs first and foremost to us lay believers, not the clergy, but us lay believers who live most intensely in the world. Christian faith is not, finally, a set of ethics or doctrines. It's not a group of theories about social justice or economic justice. All these things do have their place, and all of them are, in fact, important. But a Christian life begins and needs to be grounded in a relationship with Jesus Christ. It then bears fruit in the justice, mercy, and love we're led to show to others because of that relationship. It's very dangerous to just have your faith be a cerebral experience, which is one of my temptations, you know? I mean, when you live a scholarly life, when you live in an environment like Penn or the kinds of things that kind of education leads to, it's all up here. It's not here. But it has to be here too in order to reach out to people in love. Without a passion for Jesus Christ in our hearts that reshapes our lives, Christianity is just a word game and a pleasing legend. Relationships have consequences if they're authentic. A married man will commit himself to certain actions and behaviors, no matter what the cost, out of the love he bears for his wife. And our relationship with God is no different at all. We need to prove our love by our actions, not just in our personal and family lives, but also in the public square. Therefore, Christians individually and the church as a believing community engage the civic order as an obligation of the Word of God. Human law, for example, is important because it teaches and forms a culture, as well as regulates it. And human politics always involves getting and using power, which means that it has moral implications that the Christian can't ignore and still remain faithful to his vocation as a light to the world. Now, the standard retort to everything I've just said is that religious belief is a purely private matter. Believing in Jesus Christ is an innocent, if eccentric, personal hobby at home, but Catholics should keep their religion to themselves and not try to impose it on everyone else. But that argument is dishonest in at least two ways. First, religious faith, faithfully lived, is never a purely private matter. It's always personal, but it's never private. In other words, it always shapes how we understand and interact with the public world, or it's not real. And this has very broad consequences. The law, to use the same example again, is the embodiment of what somebody believes the rest of us should or shouldn't do. And that word should is a morally loaded word with somebody's idea of right and wrong. The notion that Christians should somehow concede the making of law and public policy to other people who often directly and intensely impose what we hold to be sacred is ridiculous on its face. Second, we all believe in something. Christian Smith is a wonderful social researcher at the University of Notre Dame, wrote a book called Moral Believing Animals. Everyone, whether they consider themselves a hardcore atheist or the most religious nun on the planet, believes in something. That's a fundamental fact of human life. No matter how well we disguise it or deny it, we all, in effect, worship something. And science, for example, makes a great golden calf. It's worth remembering that the word religion comes from the Latin verb religare, which means to buy or tie. And in real life, we all, no exceptions, bind ourselves to and organize ourselves around certain basic convictions that can't be proven, but to which we nonetheless commit ourselves. For example, we all agree that certain lives matter. This is so because as Christians, I have a son with Down syndrome, so let's use that example. Certain lives matter, okay? We believe that people like my son Dan matter because all lives matter. And many people of color, for example, have suffered great injustice and been denied their dignity as children of God. But why any life matters, depends on our beliefs about the nature and purpose of the human person. Now, some beliefs are clearly more reasonable than others, but reason itself is limited by the human sense organs that our reasoning depends on, and they provide us with measurable material facts, not purpose or meaning. This is why the Church has always placed such a heavy emphasis on the mutual dependence of faith and reason. Human beings need both. Faith without reason becomes sentimental nonsense. And reason without faith is dangerous. It lacks direction and meaning, it's cold in its heart, and it always ends up as a weapon of the powerful. So why is any of what I've just said important? Here's why. Being Catholic begins at baptism. But if we want to live with honesty and integrity, it can't end there. Being Catholic means submitting ourselves in the way we think and live to certain organizing beliefs. Jesus Christ is the only Son of God. He founded the Church. The Church teaches with his authority, even when her leaders and her people are sinners. Lots of people claim to be Catholic, but unless we place Jesus Christ first in our lives, trust in the Word of God and the teaching of the Church, and practice our faith with prayer and actions, we're just lying to ourselves and everybody else, and God won't be fooled. We're also stealing from the wider community the most important gift we can contribute to society, which is the moral content of our Christian faith. Our first loyalty and our first real citizenship is not our political party or even the American nation. Our first loyalty and home is heaven. And again, that fact should rule every aspect of our lives, both personal and public. One of the real problems in American culture goes back to the comment I made a moment ago about being the most aggressively materialist culture in history. We don't think about the consequences of what comes after our lives, whether there's anything that comes after our lives, and how we're going to be judged if there is a God and if he is a just God. You know, when I was interviewing priests for the book, one of the questions I asked them was, what did COVID do to your people? I mean, did it encourage them to think about what happens if they die? And the answer was really interesting because mostly it was no. People were afraid of dying, but they weren't afraid of what comes next, if anything comes next. Because one of the effects of our culture over a long period of time, particularly the last 50 years, is it's turned us down toward what is happening in this world and the appetites of the things that we can acquire here, and we've lost a sense of transcendence. One of the effects of a really effective commercial empire like we are is to turn our attention to what we can get here and now and eliminate the horizon of the transcendent. That's where we are right now. Again, if we're not willing to witness our actions with what we claim to believe with our words, then we don't really believe it. Okay. So Aristotle taught that politics is one of the most important forms of human activity because it's the way in which we take part in organizing the welfare of the human community. But politics is always limited. We can't build heaven on earth, and when we try, we create a pretty good replica of hell instead. Utopian politics and social experiments are not just delusions, they're very dangerous. We can't simply erase the sins of the past and start over from ground zero as a society because we're all implicated in the same national story and its sins. Utopian idealism always ends badly, and the last century is one long lesson in how radically bad it can get. As a result, we need to be practical in our political goals while working incrementally to make society as good and as just as we can. Catholic civic engagement flows from Catholic social teaching, and it's precisely our Catholic faith that provides us with something valuable to contribute to society. So, okay, what are the key elements of Catholic social teaching? First, we have a duty to respect the sanctity of every life and the dignity of every individual. The disabled, the infirm, the elderly, and the unborn child are especially vulnerable in our current political environment because they usually can't fight for themselves. Second, we have a duty to serve the common good, and the two duties can't be separated. We have obligations to both. We need to respect and protect individuals, and we need to serve the common good, which involves not just providing more great stuff to as many people as we can, but also building the moral character of a society. It's not just material advancement, material progress that constitutes the common good. There's a spiritual side to it that this society in particular, but all of the ideological atheist societies of the last century denied, which stunts the idea of what it means to be human. Moreover, there's only one Catholic morality. There's not two Catholic moralities, one for sex and one for social issues, one for serving the needs of immigrants, racial justice, and the poor, and another for dealing with abortion and sex. In Catholic teaching, issues of our sexual behavior and issues of social justice are organically linked. They can't be walled off from one another as unrelated categories. They flow from exactly the same biblical understanding of who and what a human being is. So we can't be pro-life and simply ignore issues of poverty, racism, and access to decent health care. And likewise, we can't call ourselves Catholic and then wring our hands piously while we tolerate the industrial-scale killing of tens of millions of unborn American children over the last 5 decades. The right to life precedes and undergirds every other right. So how do we apply all of this to our practical political choices when no choice is ever perfect? And this is a poster child this year in our election process because, in my opinion, both candidates are political embarrassments. Well, we need to inform ourselves. It's not hard work, but it does take a little time and effort to deepen our knowledge of the faith. Exactly 20 years ago, during the John Paul II pontificate, the Holy See published its Compendium of the Social Doctrine of the Church. It's a terrific reference book, and I highly recommend it. And teachers especially should use it as a resource in their work. But on the matter of our civic engagement, our political engagement, the U.S. Bishop's 1998 pastoral statement, Living the Gospel of Life, is, I think, the very best guide that anyone could get. It's brief, It's practical, concise, very easy to read, and it's a free download on the USCCB website. What we need to understand is that many social issues are important, genuinely important, but not all important issues have the same weight. Archbishop Shapp used to use the example, and I'll use it again here. Stealing from your company's petty cash is a bad thing. Cheating on your spouse is a worse thing. Axe murdering your neighbor is the worst thing, okay? They're all bad actions, they're all evil actions, and they all cause real harm, but they don't have the same gravity. And it's misleading to tie them all together as somehow equal because they're not. The intentional killing of an innocent human being through euthanasia, genocide, infanticide, abortion, and the deliberate targeting of non-combatants in war can never be excused or supported. It's always grievously wrong, no exceptions. It's different in kind, not simply degree, from every other evil act. And in the case of abortion, of course, that's particularly close to my heart because of our son. As the great Lutheran pastor and ethicist Dietrich Bonhoeffer noted, arguments about whether an unborn child is fully a human person are both deceitful and irrelevant. The unborn child is a developing human life created in God's image, and killing him or her is an intimate, inexcusable act of violence. So I want to end by circling back to those two words I mentioned at the start, freedom and justice. Words have power because they shape or misshape our thoughts and therefore our actions. The homework I want to assign today for anyone who's interested is really very simple. Buy and read a copy of Joseph Pieper's little book, Abusive Language, Abusive Power. The text is barely 54 pages long. It takes less than 90 minutes to read, but it should be branded on the brain of every public official in our nation's leadership class. Pieper was one of the great Catholic philosophers of the last century. In his little book, he wrote that the common element in so much of modern civic discourse is the degeneration of language into an instrument of power, unmoored from any permanent truth. Actually, the language he used was an instrument of rape. That's how powerful his language was. When we lie, we're raping other people in his mind by stealing what they have an absolute right to, which is the truth from our mouths. And we need to do better than this. And we deserve to do better than this as children of God. The good news is that the human spirit thrives on truth and the bonds of love. Sooner or later, a steady diet of deceit fails because it can't sustain hope. For the past 30 years, my wife and I have had a verse from the Gospel of John framed and overlooking the family room in our home. It's that passage, you will know the truth, and the truth will make you free. Freedom and justice are just empty slogans until they're rooted in the truth of God's creation and the purpose of human life. Freedom becomes real freedom and not mere liberty, which is the absence of restraint, or license, which is basically a driver's license to do whatever we want, when we can see the world and ourselves as they really are, and then have the courage to do what's right and change them for the better. Freedom is a positive, liberty is a negative. And justice becomes real justice when it's not simply a legal form of revenge for past evils, when it's anchored in truth and tempered by mercy. Because only by forgiving others what's owed to us can we hope to be forgiven for our own sins and the debts that we owe to others. I began my work on True Confessions uneasy that I'd find a church filled with confused and defeated people. I found exactly the opposite. I found a church of overlooked, unacknowledged, but profoundly faithful people, vigorous in confessing their faith in Jesus Christ, and not at all intimidated by the world. So I hope you'll read True Confessions in that light. We convert and renew the culture by first converting and renewing ourselves in Jesus Christ. And if we do that, then all things are possible. As Augustine said, we are the times, we make the times. And so it falls to us, you and me, to make them better.